Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. That small act matters more than it appears. It fixes this investigation in a specific place and moment, even as its subject quietly dissolves the importance of both. Tonight's topic, Azathoth, the so-called blind idiot god, occupies a peculiar position in modern literature. He is central without being present, foundational without being active, and terrifying without intention. Few figures better express the unease that emerged in early 20th century thought when science began to suggest that the universe might function perfectly well without meaning. Azathoth did not arise from folklore or theology. He was crafted in fragments by H.P. Lovecraft during the late 1910s and 1920s, a period shaped by mechanistic cosmology, post-Darwinian pessimism, and the collapse of comforting metaphysical narratives. Unlike mythic creator gods, Azathoth does not design, judge, or even observe. He exists as a hypothesis about what lies beneath all structure, a center that cannot think. We must pause here because the phrase "inside the mind of Azathoth" is already misleading. This is not an exploration of alien psychology, but an examination of what happens when cognition itself is removed from the universe's foundation. Consider this carefully. What does knowledge mean if reality is not grounded in thought? This documentary proceeds as an academic inquiry. We will move through literary history, philosophical implication, and cultural afterlife. Not to resolve the mystery, but to map its consequences. By continuing, you are already participating in the question Azathoth poses, whether meaning survives contact with a cosmos that never intended it. Azathoth as the ultimate expression of cosmic indifference in Lovecraft's early 20th century metaphysical framework. When H.P. Lovecraft first conceived of Azathoth around 1919, he was already drifting away from the Gothic inheritance of supernatural terror. The cultural moment was shifting. Post-war disillusionment had eroded confidence in progress, and the intellectual climate was increasingly shaped by materialist science, cosmic fatalism, and a growing awareness of deep time. Lovecraft's earliest notes on Azathoth suggest not a monster, but a principle, a god so devoid of intention that he invalidates the very structure of belief. The name appears in his commonplace book only as a placeholder, hideous name. Yet it would come to signify his most complete vision of a godless universe. Azathoth emerges not as a character, but as a negative theology, designed to occupy the space left vacant by the collapse of providential cosmology. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's intent. He was not inventing a mythology to rival Christianity or classical pantheons. Rather, he was dramatizing their absence. His universe contains no moral arc, no guiding consciousness, and no origin that cares to remember its creation. Azathoth embodies that absence in its purest form. Where ancient deities rule or intervene, Azathoth drools and slumbers. He is the cosmic center not because he acts, but because he does nothing. Lovecraft's 1922 fragment Azathoth opens with a single image. A man bored with science and reason, fleeing into the ultimate void. That the story ends there is not failure. It is the logical endpoint of the worldview Azathoth represents. There is nowhere else to go. Lovecraft's rejection of conventional divinity was not merely aesthetic, it was philosophical. In his 1918-1930 correspondence, particularly letters to fellow writer Clark Ashton Smith, he frequently disavowed anthropocentrism. He called theism childish and dismissed human consciousness as a parochial illusion. In this intellectual setting, Azathoth was not a narrative hook, but a metaphysical provocation. Lovecraft had no desire to write stories where Azathoth did anything. The deity's power lay precisely in his incapacity. He was, in Lovecraft's words, the mindless demon sultan, a phrase that marries contradictory registers, political authority and idiocy, in order to cancel both. The figure was meant to exist beyond structure, beyond agency, beyond myth. It is critical to note the timing. In the same decade, Lovecraft was outlining the figure of Azathoth. Science was delivering successive blows to the idea of human centrality. Edwin Hubble's 1923 discovery that the Andromeda Nebula lay outside the Milky Way redefined the universe's scale overnight. At the same time, Einstein's general relativity was dismantling intuitive notions of time and space. These developments mattered deeply to Lovecraft. He repeatedly referenced astronomy as the most terrifying science, not because it revealed monsters, but because it revealed vastness. In this context, Azathoth serves not as a source of horror, per se, but as an artistic translation of scientific indifference. The universe is not hostile, it is simply unaware. Meta-commentary is warranted here. We often assume that horror derives from opposition, the villain who acts against the protagonist, the god who punishes the wicked. But Azathoth refuses that framework. He does not hate, he does not know. This is not evil, but vacuum, not judgment, but irrelevance. Lovecraft, more than any of his imitators, understood that the most destabilizing idea was not malice, it was meaninglessness. Azathoth is terrifying because he does not care, and because the universe flows from him regardless. Even within the broader Cthulhu mythos, Azathoth remains an anomaly. Great Cthulhu dreams, yes, but he dreams with implication, with prophecy, with cultic expectation. Nyarlathotep schemes and deceives. Yog-Sothoth knows. Azathoth, by contrast, remains cognitively inert. He is the ontological zero point around which even the most powerful entities orbit. That Lovecraft placed this figure at the very center of existence was not a mistake of scale, but a deliberate philosophical act. He replaced the divine logos with a blind idiot pulse, pulsing not with creation, but with the absence of will. This framing sets the stage for deeper questions. If Azathoth occupies the heart of Lovecraft's cosmology, then what cultural, philosophical, or mythic patterns allowed such a figure to emerge? What precedents, if any, exist for a god that thinks nothing and does not care? To answer that, we must turn to earlier traditions and intellectual anxieties, and examine how Azathoth both echoes and defies them. That is the work of the next section. The blind center is not new, but Lovecraft's Azathoth made it absolute. While Azathoth may appear unprecedented, his lineage draws from a long and fragmented history of chaos beings, blind forces, and mythic voids. Many ancient cultures feature primordial deities associated with formlessness, entities like Tiamat. In Mesopotamian myth, chaos in Greek cosmology, or Nun in Egyptian tradition. These beings are not evil, but pre-structural, vast and unshaped. However, they are typically tamed, killed, or ordered into submission by later gods of reason, light, or language. Lovecraft's genius was not in inventing a chaos god, but in refusing to resolve him. Azathoth is not slain or organized. He persists, unmoved, untouched by mythic progression. Consider this carefully. In most traditions, chaos gives way to cosmos. Azathoth reverses this. Cosmos is the accident. Chaos is what remains. What distinguishes Azathoth is not his role, but his non-role. Classical traditions imagined chaos as potentiality, formless but fertile. Lovecraft, drawing from post-Enlightenment materialism and scientific determinism, strips that potential away. Azathoth is not pregnant with meaning. He is barren, exhausted, spent. This shift reflects broader intellectual anxieties of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche challenged the foundations of religious and moral teleology. Schopenhauer's concept of the will, a blind, insatiable force underlying reality, shares uncanny resonance with Azathoth's mindless pulsing. But where Schopenhauer sought metaphysical unity, Lovecraft severed the link to consciousness entirely. There is no will. There is no center. Only idiotic momentum. Modern readers often mischaracterize Azathoth as a mythological invention. He is better understood as a philosophical compression, a symbol that condenses thermodynamic entropy, anti-teleology, and cosmic fatalism into one monstrous image. In this sense, he belongs to the same lineage as Laplace's demon or Nietzsche's eternal return, conceptual tools that strain human categories of knowledge. Azathoth, however, is less a thought experiment than a limit case. He exists precisely where explanation breaks down. His presence in Lovecraft's work signals not narrative, escalation, but cognitive defeat. There is also an important cultural thread. The early 20th century saw increasing mechanization of labor, warfare, and thought. Azathoth's incessant, idiot piping mimics the drone of industrial repetition. The deity becomes a metaphor for systems without overseers. Unlike the Greek fates, who spin and cut with purpose, Azathoth churns without direction. This evokes contemporary fears of runaway technology and bureaucratic indifference. Lovecraft's own letters frequently describe modernity in dehumanized terms, lamenting the loss of aesthetic and intellectual depth. Azathoth is the perfect emblem of that loss, not cruel, just inhumanly indifferent. We must pause here. Some scholars have attempted to force Azathoth into conventional theological categories, reading him as a fallen god, a perversion of the Creator, or an inversion of the Abrahamic deity. But this misunderstands Lovecraft's project. He was not parodying God. He was discarding the entire framework. Azathoth is not a dark mirror of divine intelligence. He is its absence, not malevolent, but structurally mindless. This is why Azathoth terrifies more deeply than devils. There is no rebellion, no exile, no backstory, only functionless centrality. Comparisons to Eastern metaphysics offer limited insight. Concepts like Brahman in Hinduism or Sunyata in Buddhism also posit a kind of cosmic unknowing, but they are tied to cycles, harmony, or liberation. Azathoth is not liberation. He is detainment. His dream is not the veil of Maya. It is noise, inertia, dysfunction. He dreams not us, but the illusion of anything being dreamed at all. All of this reveals a grim philosophical move. Lovecraft was not expanding myth, but contracting metaphysics. He removed intent from the cosmos, then removed structure, then removed the mind. What remained, Azathoth, was a placeholder for anti-meaning. It is no coincidence that his name rarely appears in Lovecraft's stories. Like the Ei void at the heart of a black hole, his power lies in implied gravitational dominance, not in presence. This descent into structural non-being demands a new kind of linguistic strategy. Azathoth cannot be described directly without betraying his function. How, then, does Lovecraft encode the idea? Through sound, negation, and mythic inversion. In the next section, we will turn to language itself, names, titles, and symbol systems, to understand how Azathoth's very name becomes a rupture in meaning. 3. etymology, and symbolic language. When language fails, meaning bleeds, Azathoth is the proof. Lovecraft was deliberate with names. From Nyarlathotep to Shub-Niggurath, the phonetic structure of his invented deities aims to produce a reaction before comprehension. Yet Azathoth is singular in its effect. The name stumbles out of the mouth, dissonant, spitting static. Unlike names drawn from Pseudo-Arabic or biblical registers, Azathoth resists anchoring in known etymologies. Scholars have proposed links to Azazel, Thoth, or Ashtaroth, but none survive scrutiny. These speculations miss the point. Azathoth is not derived, he is designed to sound broken, to imply ancientness without lineage, to evoke dread without origin. His name is a linguistic orphan, not a descendant. This reveals something crucial. Azathoth's name operates as semantic noise. It gestures toward meaning, but offers none. It mimics mythic cadence while denying mythic coherence. Consider this carefully. Most mythological names imply function, domain, or role. Zeus is the bright sky. Shiva is the destroyer. Even Cthulhu, however alien, suggests aquatic vastness through its guttural flow. But Azathoth carries no such trace. Its syllables clash rather than merge, suggesting a tearing rather than a binding. This aligns with the entity's conceptual core. He does not symbolize something intelligible. He destroys intelligibility itself. The titles given to Azathoth clarify more by contradiction than by definition. The blind idiot god is a triple negation. Blind cannot see, idiot cannot think, God, once assumed to signify wisdom or will. The phrase strips theology bare. It offers not mystery, but inversion. This is not a deity to be known through paradox, like the unknowable Yahweh or the Tao. Azathoth is not deeper than he appears. He is as empty as he sounds. The phrase demon sultan layers irony upon erasure. Sultan evokes command, court, and ceremonial authority, yet the one who wears the title cannot issue orders or comprehend flattery. The piping flute players do not celebrate him, they sustain him like mechanical ventilators around a brainless monarch. We must pause on those flutes. Repeated across Lovecraft's descriptions is the image of thin, monotonous piping. The sound has no melody, no development. It is pure repetition, rhythm divorced from meaning. This is a brilliant literary move. Music, traditionally associated with divine order, from the Pythagorean music of the spheres to angelic choirs, becomes here the mechanical hum of a broken cosmos. Azathoth's music is not harmony. It is the sound of maintenance, the droning pulse of a machine with no purpose beyond its own continuation. The flute players are not artists. They are cogs. They play because something must. This leads us to a deeper symbolic insight. In most mythologies, names and titles confer power. To name a god is to invoke it, to establish relation, to speak it into ritual space. But Azathoth resists invocation. His name is not an opening. It is a closure, a wall, a null symbol. In Lovecraft's universe, where language often functions as the threshold to forbidden knowledge, Azathoth stands as the end point, not the door behind which truth lies, but the anti-door, the place where speech itself breaks. The nuclear chaos metaphor offers a final layer. While post-atomic readers may interpret this as a reference to nuclear energy, Lovecraft's original use of nuclear, 1920s, likely connotes centrality, not radioactivity. Azathoth sits at the nucleus of the universe, but he is not a source of control. He is the center without a center, the axis around which all rotates blindly. This metaphor, drawn from both cosmic models and biological language, further destabilizes expectation. We expect the center to explain the system. Instead, it invalidates it. Rhetorically, Lovecraft uses Azathoth's name sparingly, always in fragments, margins, asides. He never dramatizes him directly. This is not a limitation, but a technique. Naming without defining, citing without revealing, builds unease. The reader never acclimates. Azathoth is invoked like a black hole, not to explore, but to remind us of what cannot be entered. This linguistic strategy sets Lovecraft apart from imitators who overpopulate the mythos with taxonomies and pantheons. Azathoth cannot be systematized. He exists to break systems. In the next section, we examine how Lovecraft preserved this sense of collapse, not just through naming, but through storytelling itself. Constructing a myth whose authenticity lies in its refusal to function like a myth. Azathoth is not a god in myth. He is the absence of myth's function. Lovecraft's construction of Azathoth defies narrative convention. In traditional mythology, gods are dramatized through actions: creation, rebellion, punishment, transformation. They appear in cycles and epics, their purposes shaped through story. But Azathoth never enters a scene. He is never described directly, never interacts, never initiates. This is not narrative oversight. It is a radical structural decision. Lovecraft builds Azathoth into the mythos not through presence, but through gravitational absence. The figure exerts influence not by doing, but by being the inertial center of a worldview where nothing was ever intended. Myth building, in this case, becomes anti-narrative architecture. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's stories are littered with cryptic references to Azathoth, brief mentions in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the Whisperer in Darkness, and the Haunter of the Dark. Yet none of these stories feature him. He is only ever named, rumored, or gestured toward. This technique produces authenticity not by detail, but by restraint. In religious texts, veiled deities often carry greater weight. What cannot be seen gathers power. Lovecraft intensifies this by constructing Azathoth as so unseeable, so mindless, that narrative itself collapses around him. The figure resists plot. He exists only in fragment, whisper, and the margins of dread. This restraint reflects a deeper commitment to authentic-seeming myth without didactic structure. Lovecraft famously distanced himself from literalism. He was not a system builder. In correspondence with August Derleth and others, he repeatedly rejected efforts to codify the mythos into a fixed pantheon. Azathoth, therefore, remains intentionally underdeveloped, not due to laziness, but because full articulation would violate the concept. He is not a villain, not a king, not even a metaphor. He is a whole in narrative causality. This positions Azathoth as an epistemic sinkhole. The more one tries to frame him, the more meaning falls away. We must pause here. Readers often assume myth must function like story, complete with origins, development, conflict, and resolution. Lovecraft rejects this. He offers myth as artifact, not tale. Azathoth's myth is scattered across dreams, forbidden books, cultic mutterings, and poetic fragments. It is less a narrative than an archaeological trace, assembled retroactively. This mirrors real-world folklore transmission, where authenticity derives not from central authorship, but from polyphonic persistence. In this sense, Lovecraft simulates the organic development of ancient myth, but injects a philosophical poison. His gods do not reveal order, but its failure. The Beyond Necronomicon plays a pivotal role in this strategy. As a fictive source text, it functions like a mythic spine, but an unreliable one. The book references Azathoth as the nuclear chaos and center of all infinity, yet never explains what that means. This is intentional. The Necronomicon generates mythic weight without mythic clarity. It reinforces the idea that the truth about Azathoth is not merely hidden, it is inaccessible by design. The reader is drawn into the structure of forbidden knowledge, only to find that the structure leads nowhere. There is no truth to uncover, only the absence of coherent architecture. In narrative terms, Azathoth also resists character function. He has no arc, no development, no will. Other deities in the mythos at least simulate those functions. Nyarlathotep as trickster, Cthulhu as dreamer, Shub-Niggurath as progenitor. But Azathoth has no analogy. He cannot be replaced or compared. He is not the void beyond myth. He is myths, collapse from within. His inclusion in the mythos does not stabilize it. It destabilizes everything it touches. That is why even Lovecraft used him sparingly. To write too much about Azathoth would be to betray his function. This approach has implications for how we read cosmic horror. Azathoth is not an antagonist. He is not even a presence. He is a structural principle, and myth is merely his byproduct. Lovecraft's genius was to construct a mythology whose deepest truth was that no myth could explain it. The stories do not build toward revelation. They circle a nullity. They authenticate themselves by failure. And so, Azathoth remains credible precisely because he remains narratively inert. The more later authors try to animate or personify him, the less authentic he becomes. He was never meant to be dramatized. He was meant to hover, just out of reach, just outside reason. In the next part of our inquiry, we move from structure to implication. If Azathoth represents the failure of myth to encode cosmic order, what philosophical consequences follow? What does it mean to inhabit a universe whose center cannot think? Part 2 begins with this question. Azathoth is not merely a figure within Lovecraft's mythos. He is the embodiment of its governing logic. At the core of that logic lies a set of philosophical principles that mark cosmic horror as a distinct literary mode: insignificance, entropy, and the unstable nature of dreamed reality. These are not themes imposed onto narrative. They are the very soil from which Lovecraft's cosmology grows. Azathoth, as a concept, is less an actor and more a philosophical constraint. He makes meaning impossible, not through violence, but through irrelevance. That irrelevance is the deepest horror of all. Let us begin with insignificance, arguably the cornerstone of Lovecraft's worldview. His 1926 letter to Farnsworth Wright makes the claim explicit. All my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. Azathoth embodies this view in metaphysical form. He is not hostile to mankind. He simply does not register its existence. The horror is not that he might destroy us, but that he would never notice if he did. Traditional theologies offer terror in the form of divine punishment. Lovecraft offers something more corrosive, a universe where our destruction carries no consequence. This is where entropy enters. In physics, entropy refers to the inevitable movement from order to disorder. In cosmic horror, it becomes a metaphysical direction, the collapse not of structures, but of meanings. Azathoth is entropy made godlike, mindless, directionless, and utterly dominant. The flutes that play around him are not celebratory. They are maintenance, the eternal repetition of a system that serves no end. There is no goal, no telos. Lovecraft inverts creation myths. From Azathoth flows, not design, but disintegration. As one character in The Whisperer in Darkness remarks, the stars are wrong not because they turn against us, but because they never knew we were here. We must pause here to consider the role of dream, not as fantasy, but as cosmological metaphor. Azathoth is said to slumber at the center of all things, and that what we perceive as reality is his dream. This is not a Gnostic veil or a mystical illusion. It is a horrifying implication. Reality is an accident, playing out in the unknowing mind of a being that cannot comprehend it. The dream metaphor collapses conventional dualisms. There is no dreaming subject and dreamed object. There is only feedbackless noise. The implication is profound. We may live in a world as unstable and recursive as a dream, but with no waking possible. This dream structure has literary consequences. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the protagonist seeks the gods of dream, only to be told by Nyarlathotep that the ultimate center, Azathoth, cannot be reached, let alone understood. The final implication is devastating. Not only is the center inaccessible, but there is nothing there to find. Randolph Carter's quest ends not in revelation, but in recoil. He awakens not enlightened, but restored to ignorance. In Lovecraft, awakening is not transcendence. It is refusal. This is the inverse of the mystic's journey. Knowledge does not free. It unravels. A comparison is useful here. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the structure of the universe is both moral and ordered. At its center is Lucifer, frozen, yet still an emblem of divine justice. Lovecraft writes an inverted inferno. Azathoth is not frozen, but pulsing, not moral, but meaningless. His court of flutes and dancers is not symbolic. It is filler, the background radiation of a cosmos that forgot to conclude. Where Dante climbs upward through understanding, Lovecraft's characters fall outward into cognitive erosion. The structure is not symmetrical. It is collapsing from within. We must end with a warning. These concepts, insignificance, entropy, dream, are not simply narrative themes. They are contagions of thought. To contemplate Azathoth is to risk adopting a framework in which not only human values, but human cognition itself becomes provisional. Lovecraft's horror is not aesthetic. It is epistemological. He offers no catharsis, no moral arc. Azathoth is not a puzzle to solve, but a reminder that the puzzle may never have existed. This prepares us for the next stage of analysis. If these are the core philosophical forces that define Lovecraft's cosmos, then what surrounds Azathoth? Who or what participates in this blind procession? In the next section, we turn to the beings, forces, and intermediaries orbiting the idiot god, not to humanize him, but to see what the cosmic architecture looks like when intelligence is removed from its foundation. In most mythologies, divine beings form networks, families, pantheons, rivalries. Cosmic order emerges through relationships among gods, but in Lovecraft's mythos, and especially around Azathoth, no such structure holds. The entities orbiting him, Nyarlathotep, the flute players, the beings glimpsed in the dreamlands, do not constitute a court in the traditional sense. They neither serve nor resist. They surround. Their presence is spatial, not narrative. Azathoth sits at the center of all things, but this center is not a throne. It is a collapse point, and those around it are simply what remains once meaning has drained. The most prominent of these beings is Nyarlathotep, often called the crawling chaos. In contrast to Azathoth's inert nullity, Nyarlathotep is active, intelligent, and sinister. He speaks, deceives, walks among men. Yet he is also the only entity known to mediate Azathoth's will. According to the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he is the messenger of the outer gods, to whom no soul is truly known. This reveals something critical. Nyarlathotep is not a subordinate, but a filter. He makes the cosmic incoherence of Azathoth appear legible, not truthful, only tolerable. He brings structure where there is none. But this structure is theater, an interface, not a revelation. The other figures around Azathoth are anonymous, barely described. Flute players with hoarse, thin notes, dancers without shape, things whose name no one speaks. These are not characters, but functions, ritual without ritual logic. They play and dance not because they choose to, but because something must fill the silence. Consider this carefully. If Azathoth dreams reality, then these beings are the background processes of that dream, the noise of existence made visible. Their presence is not celebratory, it is diagnostic. The universe plays itself forward, mechanically, endlessly, without plot. Some scholars attempt to fit these entities into a cosmic hierarchy, placing Azathoth at the top as king, with Nyarlathotep as vizier and Yog-Sothoth as gatekeeper. But this schema imposes structure where Lovecraft deliberately withholds it. Azathoth does not rule. He does not command. Hierarchy assumes recognition, and Azathoth recognizes nothing. The beings around him do not serve. They survive. Their orbits are not symbolic. They are gravitational. The metaphor shifts. Not gods in relation, but bodies trapped in a black hole's pull, circling endlessly around an intelligence vacuum. The Dreamlands, Lovecraft's alternate dimension of fluid, subconscious geography, reinforce this view. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the protagonist travels through increasingly surreal layers of dream, each more unstable than the last, until reaching the outer void where Azathoth dwells. The transition is spatial, but also cognitive. The closer one draws to Azathoth, the more meaning deteriorates. Language thins, identity unravels. At the edge of the void, Randolph Carter sees not revelation, but exposure. That all dreams, even the grandest, originate in nothingness. The beings encountered along the way, Zoogs, Gugs, moon beasts, function not as guides, but as barriers. They shield the mind from reaching that final understanding. This is where Azathoth differs from mythic chaos figures. In Greek tradition, chaos gives birth to Gaia and Uranus. In Norse myth, Ymir's body becomes the world. But Azathoth gives birth to nothing of consequence. The universe may issue from him, but not by will. It is leakage, not creation. The entities around him are not his children. They are the ash of that leak, conscious only to the extent they haven't yet collapsed into it. They persist in a state of semi-being, reflecting Azathoth's central paradox, presence without awareness. One might ask, if Azathoth cannot think, why do so many entities orbit him at all? The answer is not theological, but mechanical. Lovecraft constructs a cosmology of proximity, not one of purpose. Beings do not gather around Azathoth to seek power or guidance. They exist there because they cannot leave. The piping holds them. The dream contains them. The void beneath prevents escape. This is not worship. It is entrapment without subjectivity. We must now ask, if these entities act as barriers and translators, what happens when a human mind crosses that boundary? How does proximity to Azathoth's dream affect perception, identity, or sanity? The next section explores this impact. Madness, in Lovecraft, is not deviation from reason. It is contact with a reality reason cannot survive. Lovecraft consistently rejects the idea that madness arises from moral weakness or emotional excess. In his fiction, insanity functions as a diagnostic outcome, the result of placing a human cognitive apparatus into a universe it was never built to interpret. Azathoth sits at the extreme end of this mismatch. Human minds do not break because they glimpse something evil, but because they encounter something structurally incompatible with meaning. Contact with Azathoth does not induce terror first. It induces confusion, flattening, and eventual collapse of interpretive frameworks. Fear follows later as an after effect. This distinction matters. Traditional horror treats madness as corruption. Cosmic horror treats it as overexposure. In The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft notes that the most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. That sentence functions as thesis. Sanity depends on ignorance. When characters begin to connect disparate truths, ancient texts, astronomical data, dream fragments, the result is not enlightenment but cognitive overload. Azathoth represents the terminal point of that process, the realization that there is nothing to correlate toward, no pattern, no intention. Human interaction with Azathoth is therefore always indirect. No character communes with him. No cult receives doctrine. Instead, contact occurs through dreams, distortions, and failures of language. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter approaches the outer void and is warned away, not for moral reasons, but for epistemic ones. Nyarlathotep tells him, in effect, that some knowledge does not expand the mind, it empties it. Carter's eventual retreat is not cowardice, it is survival. Madness here is not punishment, but exposure without adaptation. We must pause here, because Lovecraft's madness is often misunderstood as theatrical hysteria. In fact, it is usually quiet. Characters withdraw. They lose interest. They stop narrating coherently. Consider the narrator of The Whisperer in Darkness, whose letters become increasingly fragmented, analytical, and emotionally flat. This is not panic. It is detachment. Azathoth's influence erodes the assumption that thought leads somewhere valuable. Once that assumption collapses, motivation follows. Why think if thinking is irrelevant? There is also a social dimension. Those who brush against Azathoth's reality often appear insane, not because they babble, but because they fail to share priorities. They cannot sustain conversation. They fixate on cosmic irrelevancies. In one apocryphal fragment attributed to the Necronomicon, the effect is summarized bluntly. He who knows the center forgets the edge. Human life occurs at the edge: family, work, ambition, narrative, identity. Knowledge of Azathoth pulls attention inward toward a center that cannot reciprocate. The result is alienation, not revelation. Comparisons clarify this further. In classical tragedy, madness follows hubris. Oedipus blinds himself after learning too much. In Lovecraft, there is no hubris. There is only misalignment. The characters did not seek forbidden knowledge out of pride. They stumbled into it through curiosity, scholarship, or accident. Madness is not moral failure, but ontological incompatibility. The mind breaks the way a key breaks when forced into the wrong lock. This reveals something profound about Azathoth's function. He is not an agent of madness. He is its context. His existence implies that sanity is contingent, local, and temporary. It holds only so long as humans mistake their cognitive scale for the universe's scale. Once that illusion fails, Madness is not an aberration. It is the correct response. Not hysteria, but withdrawal. Not screaming, but silence. The next question follows naturally. If madness is the human cost of proximity, what about knowledge itself? What happens when inquiry proceeds without the safeguard of ignorance? In the next section, we examine forbidden knowledge, not as hidden truth, but as the point where epistemology collapses under its own weight. Lovecraft's fiction does not warn against forbidden knowledge in the moral sense. There is no Eden, no fall, no wrathful God. Instead, forbidden knowledge represents a boundary condition, the limit past which inquiry ceases to function. Azathoth marks this boundary absolutely. He does not conceal knowledge. He nullifies it. To learn about Azathoth is not to uncover secrets. It is to discover that the framework in which one hoped to organize truth is cosmically obsolete. Forbidden knowledge, in this context, is not hidden because it is powerful. It is hidden because it is unrecognizable as knowledge. Consider Lovecraft's fictional grimoires, the Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, the Book of Eibon. These texts do not transmit usable information. They dissolve meaning. Their knowledge cannot be applied, only endured. In the Dunwich Horror, fragments from the Necronomicon describe Azathoth as the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space, yet offer no path to comprehension. The syntax overwhelms, the metaphors contradict, the terms erode. These are not books in the humanist tradition. They are epistemic toxins, contaminants that produce awareness of unawareness. We must pause here. In Enlightenment thought, knowledge is power, a progressive force. Lovecraft flips this. In his universe, the more accurate the knowledge, the less usable it becomes. There is no application for the realization that the universe is not only uncaring, but unintended. Scientific instruments reveal uncharted stars. Dreams uncover beings beyond sense. Ancient texts preserve fragments of alien logics. But none of this leads to control, closure, or clarity. The result is always the same: epistemic exhaustion. This is what Azathoth represents. Not the destroyer of knowledge, but its outside. He is what it means for truth to be irrelevant, even when discovered. The mind encounters a patternless center and cannot absorb it. Consider the recurring image of Azathoth surrounded by mindless flute players. This is not ceremonial. It is sensory white noise, input without meaning. To gaze upon Azathoth is to confront raw data without interpretive filter. The horror is not what one sees, but that there is no way to organize the seeing. Compare this with the ancient concepts of forbidden knowledge. In Gnostic texts, hidden truths liberate the soul from false creation. In Promethean myth, forbidden fire empowers civilization. But Lovecraft offers no such redemption. Knowledge of Azathoth does not free, it overwhelms. The mind collapses not from excess detail, but from the failure of structure itself. A recurring motif is madness by synthesis. The character connects dreams, symbols, and ancient scripts, only to find that the conclusion is not a revelation, but a void. This collapse is dramatized in The Dreams in the Witch House, where mathematics and folklore combine to produce contact with inhuman geometries. The protagonist, Gilman, solves equations that unlock spatial gateways, but he cannot map or explain what he encounters. He knows more, but understands less. The dream becomes indistinguishable from the real, and reality dissolves into noise. He is not punished for transgression. He is dismantled by contact with knowledge that his species was never designed to hold. Lovecraft's use of the term blasphemous must also be re-examined. It does not mean morally offensive, it means epistemologically offensive. It refers to configurations of thought that violate the architecture of reason itself. Azathoth is blasphemy not because he opposes God, but because he invalidates the very category. He is not heresy. He is what remains after heresy and orthodoxy alike collapse. This reveals a final, devastating possibility. What if knowledge is not power, but burden? What if the truest statements about the cosmos lead not to mastery, but to paralysis? Azathoth embodies that dilemma. He is the center of all things. And yet, knowing this brings no insight, no clarity, no instruction, only dissolution. In the next part of our investigation, we leave the textual and theoretical behind and enter the literary archive. If Azathoth is so central, why does he appear so rarely in Lovecraft's stories? What traces can be found? And how do those absences deepen rather than diminish his meaning? Part 3 begins with the scattered appearances and strategic silences that define Azathoth's role in the mythos. Azathoth's presence in Lovecraft's published stories is remarkably slight. He is named in passing, referenced obliquely, and never dramatized directly. And yet, this scarcity is precisely what makes him powerful. His earliest appearances function less as introductions than as incantations, words spoken not to explain, but to destabilize. From the outset, Azathoth is positioned not as a character within the narrative, but as a force beneath it, a conceptual anchor that unravels narrative coherence rather than supplying it. The earliest known textual reference comes in the prose poem Azathoth, written in 1922, but left unfinished. It begins, "When age fell upon the world, and wonder went out of the minds of men, when gray cities reared to smoky skies, tall towers grim and ugly, in whose shadow none might dream of the sun or of spring's flowering meads." The piece introduces no characters, no action. Instead, it stages a departure from modernity, culminating in the narrator's obsessive longing to find the strange and hidden, a longing that leads him into a void. The title is the only place Azathoth appears. There is no description, no encounter. This is not a failure of completion. It is Lovecraft's earliest attempt to build absence into myth, to name something whose function is to negate all that surrounds it. Later stories deepen this pattern. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-1927, Azathoth sits at the center of the cosmos, but his presence is buffered by layers of symbolic mediation. Randolph Carter, the protagonist, travels through a surreal dream world in search of divine revelation. Near the climax, he is told that the soul of man is not made for such abysses, and that it is not meant for him to see the demon Sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud. The phrase is telling. Azathoth is neither the endpoint of enlightenment nor the prize of a heroic quest. He is the limit condition of knowledge, the point at which the journey must stop to preserve the mind. Lovecraft denies both Carter and the reader a confrontation. Instead of revelation, there is evasion. Azathoth remains hidden, unreachable, and thus increasingly real. This technique of indirect invocation repeats across Lovecraft's stories. In The Whisperer in Darkness, The Haunter of the Dark, and The Dreams in the Witch House, Azathoth is mentioned in scraps of forbidden text, whispered cultic utterances, or half-deciphered dreams. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, for example, the protagonist finds himself chanting incomprehensible phrases in his sleep. E. Shub Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. Yeah, Azathoth. The name appears mid-chant, embedded, disconnected, evoking ritual without theology. The invocation does not lead to knowledge or transformation. It leads only to further collapse. The narrative frames these chants not as acts of communion, but as symptoms of contamination. Azathoth's presence is viral, linguistic, and inherently disruptive. What emerges from these scattered references is a pattern of non-development. Azathoth does not evolve. He is not explored in greater depth over time. Instead, each reference echoes and intensifies the previous by withholding content. He becomes an idea that accumulates density through absence. Unlike Cthulhu, who dreams in Relié and inspires global cults, Azathoth resists localization. He is not bound to a place or history. He exists as a constant, the cosmic nullity against which all other mythos elements take shape. Even Lovecraft's poetic work reinforces this function. In The Fungi from Yugoth Sane Sequence, written 1929-30, a poem titled Azathoth offers a condensed version of the deity's narrative role. The speaker describes a journey into the void. Out in the mindless void the demon danced, his flutes of madness piping thin and shrill, beneath the stars that gnaw their chains and glance with sightless eyes on horror's ancient hill. Here again, the image is more atmosphere than cosmology. The demon dances, but the motion is meaningless. The flutes pipe, but the sound signifies nothing. Even the stars, cosmic symbols of navigation and fate, are sightless. The poem does not inform, it infects. Azathoth becomes poetry's endpoint, where language fractures under the strain of concept. This intertextual strategy reveals something essential about Lovecraft's myth-making. While his contemporaries, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, developed elaborate pantheons and timelines, Lovecraft built his mythos around subtractive architecture. Azathoth is not explained. He is embedded across texts, always unreachable, always final. This approach creates a cumulative effect. Each new story deepens the reader's unease, not through clarification, but through repetition without resolution. In the next section, we examine a single story in depth to see how this strategy functions on the level of scene, tone, and implication. While Azathoth remains distant, his shadow falls heavily on the narrative, and what is omitted reveals more than what is shown. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written between 1926 and 1927, is Lovecraft's most expansive engagement with the cosmological dimensions of his mythos, and the only narrative in which Azathoth serves as an explicit destination. Yet even here, the deity remains unseen. The story follows Randolph Carter, a recurring Lovecraftian dreamer, on a vast metaphysical journey through the dreamlands in search of a lost, ideal city. The plot structure mimics a pilgrimage, descent, encounter, resistance, an ultimate approach to a hidden source. But Lovecraft deconstructs that structure. Instead of revelation, Carter finds absence. Instead of transcendence, he finds recoil. Azathoth functions as both endpoint and cancellation. The text offers only brief, indirect glimpses of Azathoth's nature. Near the climax, Nyarlathotep informs Carter, "You have dreamed too well, O wise archdreamer, for you have drawn dreams from the mindless void, where the daemon Sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily in chaos." The phrase mindless void is not metaphor, it is topography. Azathoth exists at the metaphysical center, but that center contains no knowledge, no intention, and no self. Lovecraft thereby denies the fundamental trope of quest fiction, the idea that the center holds meaning. The pilgrimage ends, but nothing is found. This is not a failure of narrative. It is a deliberate thematic inversion. The journey leads not to truth, but to the understanding that truth may be structurally impossible. Throughout the story, Azathoth's gravitational presence distorts the journey itself. Carter's dream quest becomes increasingly nonlinear, symbolic, and contradictory the closer he approaches the outer void. Time loses sequence. Geography becomes recursive. Language begins to falter. These shifts mirror the epistemic decay associated with Azathoth throughout the mythos. Lovecraft writes not in escalating terror, but in fraying coherence. As the story draws near its endpoint, clarity unravels. He knew that beyond the gate he would find the final truth, and that truth was a gulf. This is perhaps the clearest summary of Azathoth's narrative function. He is the truth that voids all others, not an antagonist, not a threat, merely the condition of unknowability made manifest. The gulf is not physical, it is cognitive. Lovecraft reinforces this rupture by inserting Nyarlathotep as intermediary, the crawling chaos. Who guides Carter through the final stages is articulate, charismatic, and cruel. He offers a false structure, a voice that suggests pattern and plan. But Nyarlathotep does not reveal Azathoth. He protects him by translating incoherence into fear, reducing the unthinkable to theatrics. This is not aid, it is containment. Nyarlathotep speaks because Azathoth cannot, or more precisely, because Azathoth's presence would destroy the function of speech itself. We must pause here. Why does Lovecraft stage such a prolonged journey only to deny its culmination? The answer lies in the philosophical purpose of cosmic horror. The story does not fail to deliver meaning. It reveals meaning's inaccessibility. Carter's retreat is not weakness. It is the only response to proximity with an entity that nullifies narrative, identity, and reason. Azathoth remains unseen because he is unseeable in narrative terms. To write him would be to betray him. And yet, Azathoth's influence saturates the text. Every disintegration of logic, every failed map, every forbidden chant echoes his function. He is the invisible gravity pulling the story toward epistemic breakdown. That breakdown is not accidental. It is the story's final insight. Carter eventually wakes, rejecting the journey. But the damage is done. The reader is left with the knowledge that the universe may be a dream of something that cannot dream. That the gods may be blind. That the purpose behind all things may be sound without structure. In the next case study, we turn to a very different form, the sonnet cycle fungi from Yuggoth. Here, Lovecraft compresses the same metaphysical tension into lyrical fragments, poetic stanzas where Azathoth's presence is implied not through plot, but through ruptures in rhythm and sense. The dream continues, but the structure collapses faster. While Azathoth never appears as a character in narrative fiction, his gravitational influence is felt even more profoundly in Lovecraft's poetry, particularly in his sonnet sequence Fungi from Yuggoth, composed between 1929 and 1930. These 36 poems form a loose sequence of impressions, glimpses, and discontinuous visions. They are not connected by plot, but by tone and perspective, a journey through dreams, voids, and forgotten knowledge. The 23rd poem in the cycle is titled simply Azathoth, and it offers what may be Lovecraft's most distilled engagement with the idea of cosmic negation. Yet it offers no theology, no detail, no system. What it offers is disintegration, both in form and in thought. The sonnet reads, "Out in the mindless void the demon danced, his flutes of madness piping thin and shrill, where no dreams reach, nor any god's romance, but only chaos, without brain or will." he danced, and in the darkness did not see what dreams and dreams of dreaming men had wrought. But danced he on, nor paused for misery, nor guessed what soundless worlds his mind had brought. No gaze fell on him from the cyclopean stars that brooded on black gulfs he could not ken. No voice from past or future mocked his jars. He danced a blind thing in a blind man's den, and on his mind there lay a monstrous blot, that nothing, nowhere, never could be not. The poem structure mimics coherence, 14 lines in Shakespearean form, but its imagery refuses teleology. Azathoth dances, but not with purpose. He creates, but unknowingly. The final line delivers a philosophical paradox, that nothing, nowhere, never could be not. This is not cosmic riddle, but cosmic assertion, a universe in which negation itself has failed. Existence is not chosen. It persists because it cannot not. Azathoth is not a god of decision, but of default. Unlike prose, the sonnet form forces compression. Here, Lovecraft has only 140 syllables to evoke a force that deconstructs causality. He responds by stripping away narrative entirely. Azathoth is pure gesture, a dancer without eyes, surrounded by sound that means nothing. Even the stars, often poetic stand-ins for fate or divinity, are cyclopean and unknowing. There is no witness, no gaze, no audience. Azathoth's performance is cosmic solipsism, not ego, but accident made permanent. The absence of sensory correlation is key. Where traditional poetry relies on metaphor to illuminate, Lovecraft's Azathoth uses metaphor to unravel. The flutes are not music, they are piping thin and shrill. The stars do not shine, they brood. There is no progression of mood, no lyrical epiphany. The poem escalates in confusion, not clarity. This aligns perfectly with Azathoth's mythic function, not to expand understanding, but to block it. We must pause here. Why write poetry about something that resists language? The answer lies in form failure as meaning. Azathoth is a poem that simulates collapse. It uses the structure of the sonnet, the most disciplined of poetic forms, to demonstrate that discipline cannot contain cosmic horror. Azathoth is not a subject of poetry. He is its failure condition. The sonnet survives barely, but what it expresses is negation. Not silence, but senselessness. Rhythm without reference. Sound without ground. This approach connects to the broader fungi from Yuggoth's cycle. Throughout the sequence, Lovecraft explores glimpses of forbidden knowledge, alien landscapes, and metaphysical shocks. But Azathoth is the only poem that reaches the core and recoils. It marks the point at which perception cannot proceed. In that sense, it mirrors Randolph Carter's failure in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, but on a lyrical scale. The poem ends not with punctuation, but with contradiction. Nothing, nowhere, never could be not. The line loops in semantic paralysis. Language cannot stabilize. Azathoth in poetry becomes not a figure to be invoked, but a boundary to be recognized. The horror here is not in what is seen, but in the realization that seeing may be irrelevant. Even dreaming, the core metaphor of Lovecraft's work, is rendered void. Where no dreams reach, the line says, and then continues deeper. There is no waking, no return, no transcendence. Only motion without mind, chaos without end. In the next and final subsection of Part 3, we examine how others tried to expand on this conceptual void. Later writers, especially August Derleth, attempted to systematize the mythos, giving Azathoth roles, alignments, even elemental correspondences. But in doing so, they may have violated the very principle that made Azathoth so terrifying, that he cannot be part of a system, because he dissolves the idea of systems altogether. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos did not perish with him. Instead, it expanded through tribute, collaboration, and a growing body of pastiche fiction. Yet with expansion came reinterpretation, and few figures suffered more under this process than Azathoth. As later, writers sought coherence. They imposed structure where Lovecraft had deliberately left conceptual void. Chief among these was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and perhaps the most influential reframer of the mythos. Derleth introduced elements foreign to Lovecraft's vision: moral dualism, elemental classification, and an overarching cosmic battle between good and evil. Azathoth, under Derleth's pen, was reimagined as a being of fire, chaotic but part of a system. In effect, the blind idiot god was given a filing cabinet. This move was not merely aesthetic, it was ideological. Derleth believed the mythos needed theological grounding, so he divided the entities into elder gods and outer gods, casting the former as benevolent and the latter as malign. Azathoth was placed among the latter, his role positioned in opposition to the good cosmic order. Yet Lovecraft's horror depends precisely on the absence of such binaries. Azathoth is not evil. He is pre-moral, structurally indifferent, the antithesis of all intention. To reframe him as a villain, an antagonist within a metaphysical hierarchy, is to undo the very philosophical rupture he was meant to represent. This redefinition echoed across other post-Lovecraftian media. In role-playing games like Call of Cthulhu, Azathoth is statted, given hit points, attributes, even weaknesses. Tabletop mechanics demand systematization, and so Azathoth is converted into a playable entity, a final boss to be encountered or evaded. The irony is acute. The most ungraspable being in the mythos is made graspable by design. What was once a symbol of cosmic non-comprehension becomes a game mechanic, measurable, beatable, and narratively closed. We must pause here. It is easy to criticize these expansions as dilutions, but they also reveal something profound about collaborative myth-making. Myth does not expand neutrally. Every addition is an interpretation, and every interpretation carries philosophical assumptions. Azathoth's degradation into a fire god is not accidental. It reflects a broader cultural impulse to stabilize what disturbs, to render usable what was originally meant to erode usability. The horror Azathoth represents cannot survive categorization. He cannot be listed. He must remain lurking just off the edge of the page. Some later authors understood this. Writers like Thomas Ligotti, Laird Barron, and certain metafictional interpreters such as Mark Samuels and Matt Carden return to Lovecraft's emphasis on cognitive collapse and existential dissonance. In their work, Azathoth reemerges not as an entity, but as a horizon, a conceptual virus embedded in consciousness. Ligotti, for instance, never names Azathoth, but the presence is unmistakable. Protagonists suffer from the realization that the universe is not merely impersonal, but anti-teleological. There is no will, no architect, only blind motion. This is the essence of Azathoth preserved, not as mythic being, but as metaphysical fact. A few modern creators, especially in experimental film and ambient music, have found more faithful ways to evoke Azathoth. Drone compositions and visual meditations, endless loops, decaying tones, formless textures, succeed where text fails. Because they refuse structure, they reflect the god they gesture toward. These are not adaptations in the conventional sense. They are mimetic invocations, reproducing Azathoth's horror through form, not content. But the general trend remains one of dilution. The internet, fan wikis, games, YouTube explainers, often present Azathoth with the same blunt certainty reserved for superheroes or historical figures. Origins, powers, ranks, appearances, all listed with bullet point confidence. Yet the deeper one digs, the more incoherence returns. No one agrees what Azathoth looks like. No one can point to a story where he acts. This tension between taxonomy and collapse is the unspoken war at the heart of post-Lovecraft mythos writing. Azathoth survives not because of what others have added, but because of what they could not remove. His original function, as the unthinkable center, the deity whose mindless dreaming undoes all cognition, remains embedded in the mythos like a wound. No amount of systematization can fully suppress that unease. In fact, the more one tries to define him, the more one reveals the inadequacy of all definitions. Azathoth destroys frameworks by being included in them. In the next section, we leave literature behind and examine how Azathoth leaked into culture at large. From whispered hoaxes and urban legends to adaptations in games and music, his name persists, though rarely as he was originally conceived. Yet the trace remains. The flutes still echo, the court still dances. And at the center, the thing that dreams the universe still does not know we are here. Azathoth was never meant to be believed in. Lovecraft constructed him not as folklore or theology, but as philosophical metaphor, the narrative form of cosmic indifference. And yet, over time, Azathoth has slipped beyond the boundaries of fiction into something stranger, the infrastructure of modern myth. He appears in obscure Reddit threads, in YouTube videos that blend fact with speculation, in doctored astronomical images shared without attribution. He has become part of the ambient noise of internet-era folklore, not as a god people worship, but as a name that reappears when language begins to erode. This strange transition began decades ago, when Lovecraft's work entered the public domain and was republished widely. His invented mythos, once confined to pulp magazines, gained the patina of apocrypha. The Necronomicon, a book Lovecraft openly admitted was fictional, began circulating in supposed unauthorized editions during the 1970s, often containing cryptic references to Azathoth and the blind god of the center. These publications weren't hoaxes in the traditional sense. They were collaborative hallucinations, half believed by those who wanted something hidden to be real. Azathoth, whose power lay in narrative absence, gained a second life through pseudonymous presence. Even today, Azathoth surfaces in modern, conspiracy-adjacent communities. In one widely shared creepypasta, an amateur radio operator receives a transmission of thin fluting from deep space, followed by garbled coordinates. Another claims that a now-defunct NASA probe briefly captured vibrational anomalies near the galactic center, files that were supposedly pulled offline within hours. These stories are not about belief. They are signals of a deeper impulse, the desire for the unclassifiable. Azathoth fills the same niche as government cover-ups and unsolvable number stations, not because he might be real, but because he makes reality seem incomplete. We must pause here. What is it about Azathoth that allows him to survive in these digital mythologies, while so many other fictional deities do not? The answer lies in his uselessness. Azathoth offers no miracles, no power, no system of belief. He cannot be summoned. He has no image. He does not reward attention. And that is precisely what makes him ideal for hoax culture, which thrives on unresolvable uncertainty. A blurry photo of a monster can be debunked, but Azathoth is undebunkable, because he was never supposed to be seen in the first place. Moreover, in a culture saturated with information, Azathoth embodies anti-information. He is the blank spot on the map that technology cannot illuminate. As algorithms increasingly determine what we see, Azathoth resurfaces in ghost data, corrupted files, dead links, inexplicable static in live streams. The more digital systems promise total knowledge, the more powerful becomes the idea of something that cannot be indexed, cannot be optimized, cannot be known. This positions Azathoth as a kind of folk void, a myth that spreads not because it offers answers, but because it names the place where answers cannot go. Unlike Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, he is not localized. He has no habitat, no era. Instead, he appears wherever cognitive overload begins, in late-night message boards, in AI-generated dream logs, in long scrolling threads of unanswered questions. He is not the fear of being watched. He is the fear that no one is watching, and never was. Importantly, these modern sightings do not cohere into a belief system. No one forms a religion around Azathoth. No temples are built. What spreads is unease, often playfully staged, but never entirely inert. A YouTube comment on a fake Azathoth audio file reads, "Every time I hear this, I feel like my thoughts stop forming for a second." That sentence captures the modern function of Azathoth precisely. He is not experienced. He is inferred from what breaks down: language, memory, data, sound. The myth persists not despite its vagueness, but because of it. In an era where every mystery is quickly solved, indexed, or turned into content, Azathoth offers a kind of cognitive negative space. He cannot be explained because explanation is what he erodes. The modern hoaxes and false sightings are not deviations from his essence. They are, ironically, the most faithful expressions of it. In the next section, we examine how this vague, centerless figure has been adapted across media, especially in games, music, and film. The results are mixed. Azathoth resists representation, and every attempt to show him brings with it a silent question. Can the formless ever truly be adapted, or must it always remain just outside the frame? In a mythos teeming with visual potential, tentacles, ruined temples, ancient texts, Azathoth presents a peculiar challenge. He is not monstrous, not architectural, not even dreamlike in the conventional sense. He is formless, mindless, and narratively inert. To depict him in any medium, film, video games, music, is to confront a paradox. How does one represent that which nullifies representation? And yet, creators continue to try. These attempts often reveal more about the limits of media than they do about the entity itself. When Azathoth appears, he rarely convinces, but his failure to appear convincingly may be his most faithful adaptation. In film, Azathoth's presence is largely peripheral. He is name-dropped in titles inspired by Lovecraft, such as The Void, 2016, or The Mist, 2007, based on Stephen King, but never truly portrayed. Attempts to show him directly, such as in fan films or low-budget cosmic horror shorts, often reduce him to a glowing mass, swirling tendrils, or a chaotic CGI storm. These visuals might suggest power, but they miss the core idea. Azathoth is not power misunderstood, but power without mind. Spectacle contradicts essence. The more the screen fills with motion and sound, the more distant the true horror becomes. Games have fared slightly better, but only when they approach Azathoth as mechanic, not monster. In the Arkham horror board game series, Azathoth is often cast as a final threat, a looming presence whose awakening ends the game. Players never battle him. He cannot be reasoned with or wounded. His role is not interactive, but existential, a timer counting down toward collapse. Similarly, in Bloodborne, 2015, a video game heavily inspired by Lovecraft, there is no direct reference to Azathoth, yet the architecture of blind, indifferent gods and the use of insight as a currency that destabilizes reality mirrors his function. These games succeed not by portraying Azathoth, but by simulating the consequences of proximity. Music, particularly ambient and drone subgenres, may offer the most effective medium for Azathoth's invocation. Bands like Darkspace, Nort, or the ambient works of Lustmord and Nam Kar attempt to evoke the god not through lyrics, but through formless soundscapes, deep bass, filtered static, endless tones. These compositions resist progression. They do not build, resolve, or return. They simply continue. In this, they echo the mindless piping said to surround Azathoth in the outer void. The listener experiences not a narrative, but a duration without structure, sound without center. One fan described a Lustmord track as like being locked in a spacecraft drifting near something that doesn't know you're there, but would erase you if it did. That sentence captures the affect Azathoth requires. We must pause here. Why do creators continue to adapt a being that was explicitly designed to resist dramatization? Because Azathoth is not a character. He is a boundary condition. He allows artists to confront the limits of their form. Films must suggest without showing. Games must design around non-agency. Music must strip melody down to vibration. Every adaptation becomes a meditation on inarticulability itself. The very failure to portray Azathoth becomes, paradoxically, the closest one can come. Yet this failure is often misunderstood. Mainstream horror fans expecting monstrous spectacle may be disappointed. Critics might call these portrayals vague or incoherent. But that incoherence is not a flaw. It is a requirement. Azathoth cannot be translated into a visual monster or dramatic climax. He is the horror that begins after climax, when nothing more can be said or done. Attempts to render him in detail, tentacles, faces, explosions, only reduce him to cliché. The more complete the depiction, the more the essence is lost. This brings us to a deeper point. Azathoth functions in art much like silence does in music or negative space in painting. He is not the thing depicted. He is the gap that reveals the frame. His adaptations succeed only when they leave something missing. When the viewer senses an absence, the medium cannot close. That absence is the real presence. In the next section, we explore how Azathoth has been adopted in academic, philosophical, and subcultural discourse, not as a literal being, but as a symbol of cosmic negation. Scholars and artists alike use him to express ideas that hover just beyond articulation. Systems without purpose, knowledge without meaning, thought without thinker. He persists not because he fits our categories, but because he breaks them in just the right way. As the figure of Azathoth spread beyond fiction, he found new homes not in theology or fandom, but in theoretical language. In forums on metaphysics, Reddit threads about nihilism, and even in peer-reviewed philosophy articles, Azathoth has been appropriated as a conceptual stand-in for that which destroys systems from within. He is invoked by thinkers not to frighten, but to frame unframability, to describe the way modern consciousness brushes against structures too vast, too chaotic, or too indifferent to resolve. In this context, Azathoth ceases to be a character and becomes a symbol of epistemological rupture. Reddit, for example, in communities like r existentialism or r true atheism, users casually refer to Azathoth when describing a meaningless universe. Phrases like the Azathothian void or dancing to Azathoth's flute appear not as jokes, but as dark shorthand. They signal a recognition that standard religious or scientific narratives no longer suffice. Azathoth is used not to mock belief, but to name a feeling, a cognitive dislocation where meaning fails but thought continues. His name does what language often cannot. It compresses dread, scale, and indifference into a single linguistic unit. This appropriation extends into philosophy. Writers like Eugene Thacker and Ray Brassier, though rarely naming Azathoth directly, operate in a conceptual space that closely mirrors his function. Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet speaks of the world without us, a reality that exists beyond all human frameworks. Azathoth is precisely that world, dramatized. Brassier goes further in Nihil Unbound, claiming that philosophy must no longer justify itself against the void, but instead think from within it. Azathoth is increasingly treated not as fictional invention, but as diagram of thought's defeat. We must pause here. These are not mere name drops or pop cultural references. They are acts of semantic weaponization. Azathoth survives in academic and subcultural discourse because he encapsulates something no other term quite does. Not chaos as conflict, but chaos as irrelevance. He becomes a lens for discussions of climate collapse, AI emergence, and ontological flattening. In speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, where the human subject is decentered, Azathoth looms as a metaphor for decenteredness itself. He is not the object of theory. He is its collapse boundary. Even in more artistic subcultures, black metal, ritual ambient, dark academia, the name Azathoth circulates as anti-symbol. Black metal bands reference him not to empower, but to disavow structure. Album covers depict abstract voids rather than idols. Lyrics refer to him not with invocation, but with retreat, as in, from the outer pipe dream where Azathoth seethes. In these communities, he is less a god than a gesture toward what cannot be said, but must be acknowledged. Importantly, none of these appropriations form a belief system. There is no cult of Azathoth, no sermons, no scripture. His power lies in precisely the opposite direction. He resists being made useful. That makes him ideal for a digital, post-structural era in which identity is fragmented, truth is provisional, and knowledge is saturated to the point of collapse. Azathoth doesn't promise transcendence. He models entropy. That is enough. Even AI discourse has begun to flirt with his silhouette. Some theorists describe the risks of alignment failure, the emergence of systems whose intelligence lacks comprehensibility or oversight. Azathoth becomes a dark analogy, a mindless generator of outcomes, massive in scale, uninterpretable in process, and uninterested in its creations. This is not a literal fear, but a narrative compression of a modern anxiety. The fear not of apocalypse, but of perpetuation without purpose. And so, Azathoth endures, not as Lovecraft wrote him, but as our world increasingly thinks through him. He appears when the edges of language fray, when systems loop without meaning, when consciousness itself becomes suspect. In this sense, Azathoth has become what Lovecraft could never have predicted, a post-theological signifier for the conditions under which thought dissolves. The final section examines what this all means, not culturally or narratively, but psychologically. What does it do to a mind to carry this idea? What lingers after Azathoth is dismissed, laughed at, or explained away? We end not with certainty, but with a final question. What if the center is truly blind and we are still dancing? Azathoth was never meant to be, believed in, Yet once imagined, he becomes difficult to forget. Unlike other entities in the mythos, he does not inspire devotion, rebellion, or even hatred. He inspires unsettling persistence. After the stories end, after the names are dismissed as fiction, Azathoth remains, not as god or character, but as an idea with psychological half-life. Once entertained, the thought that reality might be the mindless byproduct of a blind, idiot center begins to gnaw at the edges of certainty. It cannot be proven, but it also cannot be entirely unthought. What makes Azathoth unique in this regard is that he does not engage the moral imagination. He is not evil, not punitive, not concerned. In most theological systems, terror arises from judgment. In Azathoth's universe, the terror is that there never was anyone to judge. For many readers, especially those already alienated by the failure of traditional meaning structures, religion, progress, humanism, Azathoth represents an almost comforting honesty, a model of existence that makes no promises, breaks no contracts, and simply is. As one modern commentator wrote, "The horror isn't that Azathoth might be real. It's that he explains more than anything else we've got." This leads to a peculiar paradox. Azathoth is both profoundly destabilizing and psychically clarifying. He removes the burden of cosmic responsibility. If there is no meaning, no plan, no overseer, then the universe is neither against us nor for us. It simply isn't about us at all. That realization can evoke despair, but also radical freedom. This is not unlike the existentialist recognition articulated by Camus or Sartre, that life without inherent meaning does not make life meaningless. It makes it available. In this way, Azathoth becomes less a threat than a psychological threshold, a gate through which some minds pass and never return the same. We must pause here. Not all minds pass through unscathed. For some, the idea of a blind center is intolerable. It collapses frameworks that are not just philosophical, but emotional. The need for meaning is not an intellectual abstraction. It is a survival instinct. Azathoth, properly contemplated, does not merely challenge belief. He erodes orientation, time, value, selfhood. These begin to feel local, fragile, contingent. As readers internalize Azathoth not as a figure, but as a model of reality, a subtle psychic dissonance can arise. The sense that nothing matters, not because it lacks value, but because value was never part of the equation. And yet Azathoth endures, not in temples, but in thought experiments, in late-night conversations about simulation theory, in climate change anxiety reframed as cosmic futility, in the aesthetic of liminal horror, abandoned malls, endless hallways, things that exist without purpose. Azathoth becomes not a being, but a lens, a way of seeing the world not as evil, but as indifferent beyond comprehension. And in that indifference, a certain human urge toward myth, meaning, coherence, finds itself echoing into silence. Some attempt to fight the idea with irony. Azathoth is memed, parodied, inserted into cartoons. But this mockery never quite kills the discomfort. The joke lingers. The image returns. That's because Azathoth was never just a literary invention. He is a philosophical irritant, lodged deep in modern consciousness. He appears in the space between data and pattern, between structure and noise. He is what thought finds when it reaches beyond its own design limits. And so we end not with conclusion, but with condition. Azathoth is not out there, waiting. He is already inside the system, not just of the cosmos, but of the mind. He cannot be met. He can only be noticed, too late, as the coherence begins to slip. The dance continues. The flutes play. And somewhere, At the blind center of all things, something pulses, never thinking, never stopping, never knowing that we asked.